Hi everybody, bSquarklehausen here, and I'm really excited to be back once again with a classic style City Skylines video. That's right, we got cinematics, time-lapse, and then cinematics again. It's just kind of how these things work. Anyway, this is part of the City Skylines global collaboration, so if you haven't seen any of the other videos for this project, go check them out now. So first things first, I got the save from Skibbeth and was told to basically do whatever I wanted, but I had signed up previously for Industrial Waterfront. We got to basically pick what we wanted to do, so I thought that would be a good way to kind of flex what I wanted to do. So when I first saw the city and saw the save, I just quickly plotted out my first thoughts and got to work. So first thing I placed was the beginnings of a sort of a warehouse district. You'll see I end up kind of stretching out some roads, just trying to figure out what sort of space I have to work with. I'm not really used to building this sort of way, especially not recently with Presidio Bay, where instead of kind of a fictional map and this entirely fictional sort of thing, where I'm really, for those, we're studying plans and we're working off of real life geography. So this was an exercise in creativity that I maybe hadn't done for a little while. One of the few things I was definitely sure I wanted to do was figure out a very smooth way to sort of transition from the city, which was very close to this area I wanted to build, to this industrial area. And I figured to take some inspiration from Oakland, California here. And you'll see right now, I actually laid out a street and then copied it far away in order to be able to put train tracks in. This is my first time working with the railway mod, which is really nice. There's a network for absolutely everything you could possibly want with railway, which is awesome to have. So in this case, I took some of the bare tracks and very carefully lined them all up and put them into the middle of an industrial road from the industry's expansion to make street running trains. So this is something just from Oakland, from Jack London Square, where literally the mainline freight trains just run right down the middle of the street. Now, once that was kind of all set, I figured I needed a way to actually get trains over. So there's a big central train station I'm sure you've seen built already if you're keeping up with the series, but I kind of wanted my trains to come from a different angle. It doesn't make sense to send all these freight trains through downtown. So I actually went and built with procedural objects for the first time. I shrunk down my Bay Bridge supports and tried to make a lift bridge. So it took a little bit of screwing around to try to figure out how this would work best. I really tried to use the road that had already been placed, but ended up, it was a much better fit to use my Bay Bridge approach, which matches the color of the towers, and it gave me the truss structure underneath. So back to the warehouses. The important part for this was, because this was downtown, I kind of cheated here. So I used a technique that I've seen in GTA and other games where you end up with a building that kind of transitions you from one neighborhood to the next. So on the front, this brick warehouse has a clock tower and uses Ivania's loft versions of these warehouses. So they're nice. They've been finished nicely. They've got like little planters out in the front. But the back, I went and used actual industrial warehouses and kind of hid them down below. So that's really nice because it means that from the front you get the lofts, you get this nicer thing, and it looks perfect right near downtown. But from the back, it ends up so you get this great view of with the trains running through the street. You get this rail spur out, which has a couple boxcars in it, and it ended up looking exactly how I wanted to, which is really cool. It's a fun little cheat. So if you're keep your eyes open. Like, this sort of building doesn't make a lot of sense, but it helps transition the neighborhood. So the next big project was the scrap yard. So on the other end, I've cut out, honestly, most of those fades are cutting out just an enormous amount of time screwing with the networks, trying to figure out ways to get the street running rail to switch and have these spurs off to the various industries. So obviously I had to include a lot of trains. I'm me. So I really wanted to make sure that each of these industries that I'm building, each of these little areas, whether it's the warehouses or the scrap yard or the container yard that we build later, has great rail access. So that required a lot of messing around with the networks to try to get these trains working. So based off Schnitzer's Steel, which is a sort of scrapyard and steel kind of metal reclamation facility in Oakland, I went and created this really compact, nice little scrapyard. It's one of, like, not to brag or anything, but like, I haven't really seen a ton of scrapyards done in the game. There have definitely been a few. I remember the great ones in way back in Arrowhead, which I think is where these assets first came from. But I focused really heavily on trying to get a lot of different types of scrap. Not only do we have trains here for loading the cars, we've got trains at the back that are in the process of being scrapped. So I went through my collection of train cars, tried to find older ones, maybe older railroad cars, and ended up with this sort of deadline of cars. So those cars would be going to be scrapped. Obviously we have the piles and stacks of crushed regular cars, and now I went and placed out we have school buses, and then these containers are for moving scrap. This is my first time again with procedural objects, so I decided to stretch the containers to try and get more different shapes. That stretches the texture on the side, so what I did was I buried the longer containers with the glitchy textures from procedural objects. I put them in the middle and then surrounded them with the vanilla ones, with the unmodified. So you don't ever see the problem, but from the top, from the views you actually can see, you get a nice variety, which I'm very happy about. So going off of what else they had at Schnitzer Steel, they had these really cool area that was barricaded by or fenced, I guess, almost, by shipping containers. And I thought, of course, that's a super easy thing to do. It's just stacked containers. And this is where I put scrap or recycled beams and things. So a lot of decals, and more of these great props by Beard Monkey. I went and made kind of racked up steel, just kind of metal piles, and really tried to keep this section looking more organized. So this is where beams would come if you've taken apart or taken down a bridge or even a building or something like that. I continued around, just went some card crushers, and this was nice. So I spent a lot of time, and it was very boring to watch, so I cut it, but making a very generic sort of pile of scrapped vehicles and scrapped, I think there's a train car in there, there's some buses, there's some actual construction equipment, but I copied and pasted it a handful of times, and you can see that really you can get a lot from just copying and pasting some of these. So I only ended up actually spending time deeply detailing 2/3 of that whole scrapyard, but ended up being able to grab decals and small details from other spots and really make it look nice and unique. So as I fleshed out the container port, I ended up having to move the temporary tram terminal that had been set up earlier. So I tried very hard not to mess with stuff that other people had already done, but I wanted that spit of land very badly. So I thought I could actually jam the tram terminal and kind of make this really cool pocket terminal here downtown. So it's an odd-shaped lot, kind of at the corner of this more main road and wedging itself between the train tracks and where it needed to be. But I'm really happy with how this turned out. These are Cluse's LRT networks, which are just fantastic assets as well. This whole project introduced me to so many different assets and things that I had not used previously, some of which I had known about for sure, I'd known about railway and just hadn't used it yet, but I hadn't heard of these LRT networks, and they're just really nice. So a combination of a bunch of LRT networks to try to build some sort of a yard facility. It's a little small, but ended up working out. So quick set of parking lot roads to kind of push the edge around, I guess, finish off the edge. You can tell it's been a while since I've done a full-blown commentary video like this. But I'm really happy with how this turned out, basically. It's always a challenge to try to squeeze stuff that still feels realistic into these very small little awkward corners, but it ended up just really nice. I mean, a couple of these guardhouses, some fencing around the whole thing. That's really what set off a lot of this, is because it just feels like a little place, and it felt like how it should be in a city. So I'm thrilled with how this turned out. Curb networks, I'd actually not really used the network version of the curbs, but God, they're great. And ended up just a little beautification. Again, trying to figure out a way to blend downtown. Right across the street, you have this big library building and downtown buildings. So it's I wanted to make sure that it didn't seem too abrupt. We weren't just going straight from downtown to industry. There was some sort of a transition there. So really, that's kind of the trick, is to pretty up one side of the industry, and it ends up working nicely. So as we continue on, just finished off the the tram yard with a couple tram props. Unfortunately, the versions of the trams that we were already using in this save didn't have props that I could see, and the tree and vehicle props mod was just causing absurd load times, like around an hour, and I couldn't manage that, unfortunately. So I grabbed a bunch of older tram props and be like, this is the older stuff that's maybe not in use right now, and got to work on the container port. So the whole thing came together really quickly. I cut over it because it was basically just like an hour or two of me guessing wrong, basically, of how the most efficient way to lay out these containers are. These are Avania's absolutely fantastic container warehouses. So they're actual functional industries warehouses, so they'll fill and empty, but they're made out of the container props, and as they fill, they change. So right now, there's only a few of them, and you can kind of see repeating patterns, but very quickly, I just set them to balanced, set a couple of them to fill, and that means it draws trains in, it draws trucks in, and it really fills this area with activity. That was one of my big priorities for this, was to try and get things to animate and look nice. So if you'll notice, I kind of skipped over, it's now a little off screen, unfortunately, but I used animating container cranes for the train loading area. You saw them in the cinematics at the very beginning, and it was just really cool, I guess, to have stuff drive around, and especially with the trains coming through on the street running section and the cranes moving around, and I just really wanted to take this little corner and try to bring the city to life. So a cool little access road here. It was a little tricky to try to figure out what route I wanted trucks to come in on. So my first thought was just connect it up to the big tram road, but that doesn't make a ton of sense because I wanted it to connect to the industrial area, but also didn't want to force a bunch of trucks straight through downtown. So I ended up kind of curving this approach road a little strangely. It let me fit a toll booth in, which is cool. So that's kind of the check-in, like almost security area, I guess. So it's where your truck might get scanned, where you might figure out what you need to do, where you need to go. And I figured that's a good asset for that. And also it meant that I didn't have to go back to the workshop. So couple more warehouses here, just mostly to just be little offices. So struggled to find something that kind of really fit how I wanted. End up using one of these modular buildings, which I thought was very cool. It just needed to be kind of a generic office, and the modular approach let me kind of make it this cool L shape. So we ended up doing that, and just a couple parking lots added to the parking lot roads here. Finished it off. This is kind of the place everybody would drive into, and then they'd get in their trucks. This is where everybody at the port works, so, or at least where they check in to work. Really, the rest of the port got finished up fairly quickly with prop line tool and the container props, so I'm almost struggling with what to say, just because, again, I'm a little out of practice. But it's just simple detailing, and the real trick is just getting enough of like a realistic layout that it looks good from far away, and then just a little bit of variation. So a couple of these trailers have containers on them, a few of them are missing, and I think I go back through and wiggle some of them around, though that might be off camera. Really with that, like, again, I just grabbed some dotted line decals to be like, here's where you should park. I didn't want to go overboard on decals, but we had procedural objects, so I didn't feel super constrained. You'll probably have noticed that by the fact that there are just kind of decals all over the place in this build. Especially like where decals and things to show where the truck should be driving. These arrows as well, I figured this is a great spot for that. So I put arrows here to try and be like, here's where you drive if you're a truck, here's where you go, and it ends up looking really nice. I picked these ones because they look a little hand painted and just kind of crappy. Down here, of course, don't drive on the train tracks, so we just really easy prop line tool. This is one of my favorite details of the entire thing, is the yellow stripes over the rail tracks. I'm not 100% sure if it's strictly realistic. I was definitely looking at some of the container terminals, the smaller ones in Oakland as well, as I did this. But it just looks really nice, and it's a good reminder, like, don't drive here. So after that, put a couple trains being loaded. I figured we'll just drag out a fully loaded double stack on one track and then transition it with a single down to empty cars. So it's like it's being loaded from the back. And you can see the cranes will animate over them. So they don't actually pick up and carry things, but they just drive back and forth, and it looks really cool. So it's kind of a train being put together here and loaded up, which is a very cool effect. So it's really cool to see in motion. You see it in the cinematics, and hopefully I'll unpause. I was having some really awful problems with lag that eventually somebody else figured out how to fix. So thank God I could actually record cinematics, but literally the game speed was moving at just unbearably slow. I think I sat and waited for like 2 or 3 hours waiting for a freight train to spawn. And that's just, it's hard to play like that. It turned out there were about 10,000, maybe 20,000 stuck Sims waiting at the train station downtown. So we figured out that you could just click unstuck Sims or reset stuck Sims in TMPE, and there's this huge like ripple of Sims all leaving and flying to their destination. It was very funny. You saw me building up the bluffs a little bit with rocks, so there's a big terrain change between the harbor, which obviously has to be very close to the water level, and what would eventually become, or I think would eventually become, or at least was land I wanted to leave clear for, a neighborhood up above. So I used, I think they're actually strict toasters, breakwater rocks, and a few of Serentropic or Grey Flames rocks to make this really lovely bluff, which again, like I'm usually super bad at that sort of stuff, at trying to create realistic sort of nature. But this is maybe the single project I've worked on where I'm happiest with how the natural environment section turned out. Like you'll see later I do some really cool kind of swampy, marshy stuff in the corner here, and it turned out so nicely. I'm just so happy with it. So hopefully you guys will agree and you'll think it's good. Hopefully it's not just me being super out of practice with all of this. So a few weeds in the corners. I figured this is kind of, again, try to get these smooth transitions. So at the edge of the container yard, obviously the container yard is heavily used. It's all paved. So I didn't want to go from heavily used and all paved, just a hard cut to nature. And you can see here is where I'm building some of that meadow area, just with Padelmo's great meadow grass and swamp grass and things. So I used the kind of staging yards almost, again, as a transition. So they're not paved, they're dirt, they've got weeds in the corner, and I'm just really happy with how those turned out. So the swamp here, going a little overboard perhaps with some of the props, but what can you do? It's fun to have looking like this. And from up above, you can see some of the edges and things, and it looks a little strange, but when the camera's down low, you can see I like start building with the camera really low, just because it's so nice. It's so pretty, and especially with the city in the background. Of course, again, we're making some transitional elements, so it can't just be perfect lush nature. Got a pile of washing machines below the bridge. Sure, why not? You get some litter in the corner, but it ended up looking really good. So I'm really happy about that. And again, it's a little weird to have this sort of swampy area, but I figured it's tidal, right? We're right on the ocean, we're right on the water, and you've got big ships, so it's probably not the best sort of thing. One of the last things I did was this boatyard. So this was always part of the original plan, but I put it off because it was such a weird and awkward shape. But we've got this great New England dock house, and I figured that would be a perfect asset for this. So it ended up coming together way quicker than I thought it would. It's literally just like 2 or 3 pieces of parking lot roads, one of which is like the boat ramp, and then one is a yard, and then a few boat props. I highly recommend anybody makes a little boatyard like this. It's just such a great little filler. It's not hard to make. I was looking at the crane, figured no, but this crane was cool to have right here. Maybe it's how they get boats onto trailers or onto the little stands. Not quite sure if it's realistic again, but stacked them all up, messed with some colors a little bit because they were a little too bright, but unfortunately I couldn't do that. And that's it for the boatyard, really. Like, it came together so fast. I'd been putting it off because I was scared of it, but it really looked nice. And of course, now all there was to do was to finish off the coast. So a couple of more passes of the breakwater rocks. I wanted to make sure I left a gap for the boat ramp, but it's just kind of came out really well. I'm so used to these videos, well, as much as I can be used to making them anymore, but of having to like overcome challenges. But coming back to this from Presidio Bay work was just really refreshing in that like everything sort of worked. I could make these great natural areas and they looked good. It was a challenge trying to figure out what to build to match other people's stuff, but I think as you'll see later, I'm really happy. So this is a really cool detail that I was happy about too. We ended up with this gap between the boathouse and the edge of the scrapyard, right across from the warehouses in the industrial kind of area. So what I did was I turned it into like former docks. So I grabbed a bunch of pilings, they were just I-beams made by Beard Monkey, and set them as a grid. And these now look like nice abandoned and like collapsed docks. So the broken fences to kind of protect people from them, but obviously nobody really cares anymore about that. And of course, our favorite little litter and garbage decals. And then just some more like little shrubs and grass. And again, it's just such a nice detail, and the little bit of foliage looks great. And really with that, we're already into the cinematics. So end cinematics here. It's the path of a train all the way in to all the way out. And that's it for me and my part during this global collaboration. So I'd like to thank you guys all for watching. Be sure to check out the rest of the videos. The next video is over on Kaminagi's channel, so be sure to go check that out. They've made some great stuff as well, so I highly recommend it. Anyway, thank you guys all so much for watching. This was an absolute blast to be a part of. Thank you again to Paradox Interactive for setting this all up and putting it all on. I've been B. Squarklehausen, and I will see you next time. Bye.